Bonjour. Today we're going to be discussing the French Revolution and how it is described in Barak Lurie's book, Atheism Kills. Before I get into that, though, I wanted to quickly mention one thing regarding my webcam quality and regarding what I have plans for on that. Some have remarked on the not-so-great quality of my webcam and microphone, and I actually am just using the webcam on my laptop, but I will be getting a new one probably by June. I'm trying to be careful to pick out a good quality one, and I have to be a little careful, so I make sure I pick the right one. But thank you for bearing with me in the meantime. And like I said, it will only be about another month in the coming, and then I'll have one that's more appropriate for videos. But now getting to the main point of this video, I wanted to quickly address the French Revolution and how Barak Lurie describes it within his book. Barak Lurie is not the first person to use the French Revolution as an example of atheism or liberalism gone awry. And there were lessons to learn from the French Revolution. We've seen what happens when the state seizes power from kings and from monarchies, and that it can be a republic, and mobs can be just as bad as a king can, and they can be just as tyrannical. And we also learned that idealism gone too far can be a bad thing, even if the ideas are pure. And just to give you an example of how Barak Lurie is not the first one to demonize the French Revolution as being an evil product of liberalism and atheism, I have my old high school history textbook here, which is very Christian and very conservative. I would buy my textbooks ahead sometimes for some of the years, so I still have a few of them on hand from high school, so that's why I still have this. But I wanted to quickly read you a passage that just shows you kind of how much it tried to demonize the French Revolution and atheism. By this point, the ideas of the Enlightenment had taken control as atheism reached its height in France. It is no coincidence that the Reign of Terror was bloodiest as atheism was at its peak. Convinced that religion was counter-revolutionary, one extreme group of revolutionaries promoted a program of de-Christianization in France. Some revolutionaries even tried to persuade the National Convention to utterly abolish Christianity by decree. Okay, so Barak Lurie is basically about the same in his book on this. He, talks about how atheism was the reason for all the deaths of the French Revolution. And, the French Revolution was bloody. It's estimated that 55,000 died from the terror of the French Revolution. But as somebody who very much likes studying the French Revolution, and I actually find it in some ways a slightly inspiring, but also an informative event from history, from which there are a lot of lessons to be learned, I think that is an enormous misrepresentation of the French Revolution. And part of the reason for that is we have to look at what were the main motives and what were the main reasons for the revolution. Well, of course, the overwhelming one was getting rid of the absolute powers of the monarchy of France. A lot of revolutionaries just wanted to turn France into a constitutional monarchy. They also wanted to revoke the land privileges and some other powers of the church. So you could say in that sense it was secular. But in the early days of the French Revolution, the National Assembly had a lot of pre-Senate. So I would not say that, definitely in the early days, the French Revolution was entirely secular. But as the revolution went on, there's a lot of twists and turns, and I don't want to try to get too bogged down and going into so that's why I'm going to kind of have to oversimplify this a little, since this isn't a documentary on the whole revolution. But, you also have to take into account the actions of Napoleon Bonaparte once it was over, because for better or worse, whether he crushed it or whether he was the product of it, Napoleon, couldn't have come about were it not for the French Revolution because of his lower birth. So, the overall end product of the start of the French Revolution, the church had both land privileges, governmental powers. There had been, I guess you could say it was not only the primary church of France, but it was basically the exclusive church of France. By the end of it, it had been thoroughly stripped of a lot of those powers that it once had from the government. It also had lost a lot of its land privileges the priests and clergy had. And Napoleon had established it as still the primary church of France, but no longer the dominant, all-powerful one. It was no longer part of the government in the way it had been before the French Revolution. And many, many priests had died from the French Revolution, and many Christians and Catholics had been persecuted, as had some atheists and secular people during the Revolution as well. So it's it's kind of mixed overall. To say that it was, like the communist revolutions were with atheism is just a flat out misrepresentation. And on one way you can kind of infer that is also just looking at the religious beliefs of some of the French revolutionaries and what their main goals were. I mean, as I mentioned before, the main goal of the revolution was mostly abolishing feudalism, reducing the powers of the monarchy. They did many, many other good things like abolishing slavery, instituting rights for women, to some extent, to a very limited extent. And Napoleon did a lot to repeal those, but that's a long story, so I don't want to get into that. But the bottom line is, these were really the things of the revolution. If I had to put it above all else, it was about removing the powers of the monarchy and abolishing feudalism and assuring more equality for the average man within the country, and not letting your birth dictate who you are and where you can go in life, which is how Napoleon rose to power, given that he was from lower nobility. But and a part of it also was, I would say, it was a secular movement partially, and that it also was for removing some of the almost, not just, some of the repressive powers of the Catholic Church and some of its privileges that it enjoyed for centuries. So now, was there atrocities committed during the French Revolution by atheists against some Catholics? Yes. Jean Baptiste Carrier, I believe, was the one who sunk a ship, or he killed overall about 4,000 civilians in some of his battles with the counter-revolutionaries in France. In one case, he sunk a ship full of civilians, and just as a form of just brutal execution, he sunk, just tied them to it and sunk it. And another was Jacques Hébert, if I'm pronouncing that right. He carried out many very brutal de-Christianization policies against counter-revolutionaries, and both of whom were tried and later found guilty for war crimes, both by the French Revolutionary Tribunal, and both were executed. So to say that the French revolutionaries were all entirely on board with what they did is going too far. But also then looking at the number one French revolutionary himself, Maximilien Robespierre, he was not an atheist. He was really a deist more than anything. And he was against a lot of the atheist policies. And those, who know Robespierre know that he made many quotes against atheism throughout the French Revolution. Now, he wasn't, a religious person. He did want to see the Church of France reduced in its power. But when he established the cult of the Supreme Being towards the end of his reign, that kind of shows that he really was more about, I think, looking for an alternative religion rather than an atheistic one to control the country. So again, it's too complicated to say that the French Revolution was atheistic or even it was entirely secular, because it wasn't, even if it did lean in that direction. And so I think that's kind of the overall point that needs to be made. But also, there's one final thing I wanted to mention here, and that is that above all else, too, I don't know how anyone could see the French Revolution as necessarily an evil thing, or as the atheists within the movement as inherently being evil. You have to remember, for centuries, the church and the monarchy had persecuted and had bullied and had done terrible things to people that were deemed, gypsies, that were deemed heathens. And, this was a little bit of the bullies actually getting bullied. Now, was it right? No, it wasn't. But it's not, just totally unjustified or something, one of those things you can't understand at all. And I don't know how people, it is an example that liberals can go too far, and we definitely many lessons to learn from the French Revolution. But atheism was honestly just too small of a part of it to be seen as the main thing that was wrong in a movement that actually had many, many positive things in it, and many, many very, very good ideas that it just put forward in a wrong way. So I don't think in any way that the French Revolution should be seen as a mark against atheism or as against even really secularism, since on the whole the revolution was probably a force for good in mankind and gave us many lessons for history as well about where revolutions can go wrong. And like I said before, the end result of it was not an atheist product anyways in France. It was just a church that had lost the exclusive powers that it enjoyed. So I think that's just the main point I'm trying to make here against Barak Lurie's point, which is that it was entirely an atheistic movement and was an evil movement. And hopefully I did a good job of explaining that. But if you disagree, feel free to say so in the comment section below. But other than that, just Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Bye.